Hello, hello, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome you all. This is Leonardo Garcia speaking. I'm Bridge Project Coordinator. Bridge, it's an initiative administered by Forever Costa Rica Association with the financial support from the French Facility from Global Environment and the MAVA Foundation. And it aims to integrate actively the private sector into the global efforts for biodiversity conservation. The beneficiaries are RedLAC, which is the network of environmental funds from Latin America and the Caribbean, and CAFE, which is the consortium of African funds for the environment. These two networks gather 47 CTS from these specific geographical regions. Today, we are very honored to share with you the updated version of the Practice Standards Self-Assessment Toolkit for Conservation Trust Funds. This is the result of a multi-stakeholder effort, including institutions like the Conservation Finance Alliance, Forever Costa Rica, RedLAC, CAFE, and many other representatives from the CTF members of said networks. To begin, David Meyers, an esteemed colleague from CFA, will give us a foreword on the historical context of the practice standards and their self-assessment toolkit. And then we will pass the mic to Amilcar Guzman and Alejandra Revilla from Grant Thornton, who are the leaders of the consultancy that carried out this update process on the practice standards self-assessment toolkit. At the end, we're going to have the chance to make questions and answers, and feel free to post all comments or doubts in the chat that we have for you. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Leonardo, and thanks to all of the partners who have contributed to this effort, and of course the Bridge Project and the donors, and especially Amilcar and Alejandra and colleagues. As many of you know, the practice standards are a really important standard by which conservation trust funds aim to achieve their objectives and improve their governance and implementation. And we have, together with partners, updated those practice standards in 2020 and produced a really excellent version, again, with our colleagues at Wolf's Company, which is now part of Grant Thornton, and other colleagues. And this next piece here is, as you'll see from the presentation, is a really valuable tool that can help conservation trust funds that exist and those that are planning to develop to self-assess in a way that is very effective, efficient, and insightful. I'll leave most of it up to Amilcar, but so I just would like to introduce our speakers then, and again, thanks to everyone involved. But Amilcar Guzman is Senior Manager of Conservation Finance Team Leader at the Impact House of Grant Thornton, Netherlands. This is formerly Wolf's Company. Amilcar has a background in environmental economics and nature conservation, and he specializes in conservation finance through projects in Latin America, Africa, and Europe. And not only was he one of the co-authors of the updated practice standards, but also the 10-year review of conservation trust funds. It was also produced in 2020 and is available on the CFA website. And also Alejandra Revilla, who is a biodiversity and finance consultant at Impact House as well of Grant Thornton. And Alejandra has a background in economics and a master's in sustainable science, experience in risk analysis, sustainable transformation, and currently working on feasibility projects, design and support of conservation trust funds, as well as economic analysis for conservation interventions. So without further ado, passing it to you, Amilcar.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Leonardo, as well, for those introductions. I will wait for Alejandra to share her screen, so she has the slides. But in the meantime, I would like to thank as well the donors for this project, FFM and MAVA Foundation, the CTF networks, RedLAC and CAFE, for the Costa Rica Association for also all the support, and Conservation Finance Alliance, of course. Also, in addition to them, we collaborated with some conservation trust funds who tested the tool that we will be presenting today. Among others, those were the MAR Fund, Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, Mulanje Mountain Conservation Trust Fund, Micronesia Conservation Trust Fund, Madagascar Protected Areas and Biodiversity Fund, and Micronesia Conservation Trust Fund as well. Next, please. So during today's session, we will be showing. I think Alejandra, I think we're seeing your presentation mode. So if you can please share the full screen, I think that would be good. So while Alejandra does that, I'll continue introducing the contents. So today I will start with some introduction to the practice standards, to say some complementary information that to what David mentioned already, just to refresh your knowledge, because I can imagine that many of you are Conservation Trust Fund representatives, so you might have used the practice standards already, maybe the 2014 version and the 2020 version as well. And after that, I will give some introduction to the self-assessment, the self-assessment process, which is broader than the actual tool. And then I will give the floor to Alejandra so that she can give an overview of the tool, and she can also share it on screen so that we can all try it together as well. So in addition to that, during the session, I think Daniela or Leonardo will share a link to the tool, and something very important, so you can download the tool during the session. You can try it as we present it, and also very importantly, there is a manual that you can also download from there, which you can use over the coming days or in the future to use the tool. So we really encourage you to read the manual, because there is a sequence to use the tool, and it's important that you follow those steps. Now, it might be easier for you to follow the session now than try it with the manual, but if you want to try the tool directly right now to see how it works, to get more familiar with it, please feel free to do so. So regarding practice standards, well, before that, maybe next, please. We actually have a slide with, well, our picture. So you can see part of the team. Alejandro and I were already introduced, but we were also working with Gaetan Kesne, who is one of the partners at the Bastel Consulting Group. This is a Canadian consultancy office, and Gaetan is the manager of the European subsidiary. They also work on biodiversity conservation and sustainable financing for biodiversity, and they have done substantial work with conservation trust funds. Gaetan is working more on the French-speaking part. So we also, it's important to mention that we have this tool in Spanish, in English, and French. And right after this session, there is also a French session being delivered by Gaetan in French. So he will be presenting there and sharing with conservation trust funds, French-speaking conservation trust funds. Okay. So now we go into the introduction to the practice standards, or this, we will refresh some of the knowledge you probably have. Well, something very important about the practice standards is that this is a voluntary instrument, and it's an instrument that can serve different purposes. So it can be used for the design of CTFs, it can guide the design of conservation trust fund. It can be used for the management of conservation trust funds, of operational conservation trust funds, and for the evaluation of the same. The advantage of having this type of standard is that it helps with the communication between donors and conservation trust funds, and also with the alignment among different donors, because many different funders or donors adhere as well to this set of rules or principles. Conservation trust funds then can follow this document and what the information that's there, to make sure that they can meet the requirements of donors, of multiple donors at the same time. Because as we know, conservation trust funds channel funds from different sources, and in some cases, the different requires from different donors can be quite substantial. So the practice standards will help you focus on what's very important and hopefully optimize your work in that sense to meet those requirements. It's also, of course, internally a tool to support your continuous improvements, and that's of course one of the main purposes as well. The practice standards are available at the Conservation Finance Alliance website in all these 3 languages, English, Spanish, and French. And I believe that probably the English version will be available through the link that will be shared during the session, together with the toolkit and the manual. So the practice standards build on a previous version. I will say something about that in a moment. So this was an update that we did in 2020, together with the commissioned by the Conservation Finance Alliance, the networks of conservation trust funds, and in collaboration with a partnership of a task force of more than 20 organizations that collaborate with conservation trust funds, donors, etc., and experts as well. We carried out this the update in parallel to a global review of conservation trust funds, which was very important. We did this work together with Aligning Visions, with Paquita Bach. And doing these 2 projects or working on these 2 documents together helped us gather quite substantial information, because for the global review of conservation trust funds, we built an extensive consultation. We had a survey being circulated. We collected information from more than half of the existing conservation trust funds around the world. So we could also use that information to inform the update of the practice standards. So that streamlined the process. Among other things, we had to be consistent with the use of concepts, terms, etc. And that was useful for the process itself, but we think it's also a positive aspect of these 2 documents for donors and conservation trust funds to align their vocabulary. For example, here we just included one of these examples, is that we adopted the use of program accounts instead of funds, because there was at that time quite some confusion sometimes when people referred to funds and they were talking about an actual account and not the institution as a whole. So these are some of the things that we aligned, and they're reflected in those documents, and those are also reflected in the tool. Now, since the global review also identified some emerging trends among CTFs, this offered the opportunity for us to align the standards to the needs of CTFs as they evolve. Here we have some of those emerging trends that we identified at that moment in 2020 that are still valid. As you can see, many of these are still, all of these are still important issues at the moment. So, as I mentioned before, this was an update of the 2014 practice standards. And the 2014 practice standards were developed by Barry Spergel and Kathleen McKitty. And they were very successful. They were widely used. That's also something we learned while doing while conducting this research. In our surveys, more than 70%, 80% of you can check of course the exact statistics in the document, but in the global review we have that around those numbers of CTFs use the practice standards. So these documents really, the 2014 version really helped guide conservation trust funds over those years. So the original spirits and number of key aspects, including the 2014 practice standards, had to be continued. And we kept many of the aspects of these previous standards. For example, the organizing principle, and with that we refer to the structure of the descriptions of the standards, which included the reason for the standards and practical considerations, evidence that could be used for that. that was kept. And actually that was very useful as well for the preparation of the tool that we're presenting today, because those elements are also captured in one way or another within the tool. Some edits and additions were incorporated based on the interviews with donors, conservation trust funds and experts, and some core areas of the practice standards were regrouped. So next, please. In summary, these are the different things that were added in the 2020 practice standards. I will not read through all of them, but it's just for you to have an overview. Something very important is, well, what we have in the last two bullets. So we added an annex with referring to the life cycle of conservation trust fund, which is very important because practice standards are not necessarily applicable. All practice standards are not necessarily applicable to every conservation trust fund. And that's something that Conservation Trust Fund learned from after 2014 when using the standards. And this is because conservation trust funds are quite diverse. They are in different stages of evolution. Some of them are in the startup phase, and some of them are quite institutionalized, and they have very sophisticated systems. So some standards might be applicable for those more sophisticated conservation trust funds, and some might not be applicable, for example, for the conservation trust funds that are just being established. And that's important for this tool because we incorporated that aspect into the functionality of the tool. So you can filter according to the stage of evolution of your conservation trust fund to select and display the practice standards that are relevant. And of course, the other one, the other bullet that's important here is the sample of assessment tools, which was included in the 2020 version. And well, I will refer to that in a moment, but of course, that was the basis for the preparation of this new tool. So that's something that, of course, this tool replaces in a way. So if you want to conduct an evaluation, we encourage you to use those examples that are presented in the standards just as examples. But if you want to use the tool, of course, the tool will have a much better functionality, and you can use it directly in Excel, which will help you optimize the process. Next, please. So this is just an overview of what's in the 2020 practice standards. There are 7 core areas for those who might not be familiar with them. These are the 7 core areas that organize the different practice standards. And with respect to the previous version, there were 19 standards added. There are also some cross-cutting areas that are relevant for different core areas of the ones we have on the left side of the screen. Next one, please. And as I mentioned before, we have in that version, in this 2020 version, we have an annex where we put these examples of assessment tools. Those examples are, sorry, yes, that's the example that we used as basis for this. Next one, or previous one, the introduction. So before we dive into the new tool, I will introduce a few key aspects to consider for your evaluation, but in general terms. So this is before you open the self-assessment to the file that we will share in a moment. So in general, so in summary, the evaluation of conservation trust funds compliance with the practice standards aims to determine some these first 2 bullets that we see here. So whether CTF has the features, skills, tools, and to meet each standard, and whether a conservation trust fund operates in accordance with the generally accepted practices in each of these key areas, those 7 areas that I presented before. In order to obtain relevant insights, it is, of course, crucial that the assessment is based on evidence, and evidence of what is observed in practice. So not just theoretical evidence, but evidence of what's really happening with the CTF. And that's because, of course, one of the purposes of this is to inform improvements or adjust your operations for the following years or let's say, over time. So having that evidence properly recorded and compiled is important so that you can keep track and you can base your decisions on sound information. Now, the evaluation in that sense can serve internal purposes. When we talk about improvements, maybe you want to improve some processes, some internal processes. You want to make sure that the operation is working properly. But it can also be shared with other stakeholders. So here we have, well, for example, of course, the board. That's also, let's say, in most cases internal. But it can also be shared with donors and other actors, maybe for transparency or because it's requested as a requirement, etc. Next one, please. As I mentioned before, this is another very important aspect to consider when you start the evaluation, which is the stages of evolution of a CTF. This is what I refer to also as the life cycle of a conservation trust fund. And the fact that each standard is not necessarily applicable to different conservation trust funds in different stages of evolution. So here you see the 5 stages of evolution that we used at that time in the practice standards in the 2020 version, and that are also reflected in the tool. So it's important for the conservation trust fund to find itself reflected in one of these stages before starting the evaluation, so before using the tool. Next one, please. And just before we dive into the tool, just some final highlights of considerations on how to carry out the assessment. So it is important, at least based on what conservation trust funds have shared with us already since 2020 when we did the review and updated the practice standards, is that the participation of several members of the team is important, and or the board, because you need to gather input on different areas. Sometimes they are very diverse. So you have from administration to research mobilization or risk management, programs, etc. So it is important to bring all different types of expertise that you might have on your team. Of course, the process can be coordinated by an individual, by internal staff. Maybe you want to put together a working group to do so, and to basically ensure continuity within the evaluation or assessment process, right? In some cases, or in many cases so far, conservation trust funds hire external consultants. With this tool, we trust that maybe that will not be always necessary. In some cases, it might be necessary to facilitate the process, but at least it will help with cost efficiencies and the time that you might spend in carrying out the assessment. It is also important that there is a joint review and there is agreement on the responses to the assessment. So when you assign a score, it is important that the different people involved agree on that based on the evidence, and that there is a consistent approach to monitoring. So if in year 1 you carry out the assessment, it is important that you record your assumptions, your different methods, the evidence, etc., so that in year 2 or whenever you want to repeat the assessment, you can follow a similar approach. In that way, you can have comparable results. And at least in the tool, we have space for that. So Alejandra will present that when she's sharing some slides about the tool. And now we'll give the floor to her to guide you through the tool. And in the meantime, so as we switch, I think Daniela will probably share if she hasn't done it yet, in the chat, you will be able to find the link. Yes, I see it there. So you can find the link to the folder with the self-assessment tool, this new version, also to the 2020 practice standards and the manual. So please feel free to play around with the tool as we continue with the webinar. But of course, I also encourage you to pay attention to the slides, because there we will clarify the process. And of course, we don't want you to start to skip some steps that might be important in the process and then get maybe not get the results that you expect. So it is for you to try maybe now and after the webinar. So I will give the floor to, I will pass it on to Alejandra so that she can walk us through these, the structure and functioning of the tool.
Perfect, thank you very much, Amilcar. And then assuming that you, you have the link, then I will go ahead with the second part of the presentation. As Amilcar already shared before, the self-assessment tool, I mean, it's a starting point for the assessment. The end result or the expected result is that you can use the results of the assessment to improve the impact of the Conservation Trust Fund. So this tool is mainly to simplify the evaluation process, and yeah, it produces accessible results, and more importantly, results that you can ensure continuity by giving all of these explanations of the criteria that's being used for each of the standards, and then hopefully build upon all the results and then be able to have a track record of the improvement or an improvement of the CTF. So I'm gonna walk you through the structure of the tool. This tool was created in Microsoft Excel, and it is on the most, we use the most latest version of Excel. It has a box at the beginning of the introduction section that shows which is the version of Excel that's been produced on, and this is important just to ensure that all the functionality is available. Then it would be best if you have the same version of Excel. It's done with very simple functionalities. Here we wanted to avoid the use of macros or any other add-ons or plugins that could cause any problem or could reduce the functionality. And it's very simple. It has 4 tabs to carry out the whole process of the self-assessment. It has an introductory tab, an evaluation tab, a summary of results tab, and at the end, the practical considerations. So right now, the first tab is the introduction tab. That's what we're looking now at. It contains the essential information of the tool, and it also guides you through the use of the tool. So here I want to spend some time, and I know we all want to jump in and use it, and it's quite self-explanatory and it should be quite easily to use, but I do encourage everybody to spend a couple of minutes just reading the introduction and the structure of the tool. I just see now that there's a mistake. The screenshot is in Spanish, but like the version of the tool is available in English as well as the manual. So whenever you're gonna use the tool, if you're waiting until after this seminar to use it, I also encourage you to open the manual, because it really guides you step by step on everything that you need to do. And this is just to ensure that everybody can fully use it and you don't get stuck at any step. Now we're gonna go to first step of the evaluation. So when you're on the second tab, the evaluation tab, the step 1 is the selection of the relevant practice standards for the assessment. You'll find there's a cell with a drop-down menu that shows you the different options. It shows basically the 5 stages of evolution that Amilcar presented earlier, and also an extra option to have all of the practice standards as available for the assessment, or to completely tailor the assessment. And this is something I want to take a second to explain. If you choose to do a tailored assessment, it will not automatically choose some standards. And what I mean by this is, if you choose a stage of evolution, the tool automatically highlights the practice standards that you need to give a score to. So if you're in a startup phase of evolution, for example, there are fewer practice standards that apply to that moment in time in the CTF. So those are the only ones that are going to be highlighted in color, and you need to assign a score. And the rest will remain in this gray color that we can see right now on the screen. So what happens if you choose to have a fully customized assessment where you are the only one who's choosing the practice standards that you're going to assess? You can, of course, do this. You do this by selecting in these little checkboxes the assessments, the standards that you want to assess, and then you have a very tailored evaluation. So this is the first step. If you don't select something, either being it tailored or a stage of evolution, then you're not going to be able to see the scores, the drop-down menu for the scores. So I'm going to go there in a second, but this is important to just select something here. And then step 2, once you have selected the either a stage of evolution or which are the criteria that you want to choose for the assessment, you see here the standards highlighted. So those are the standards that apply or that are relevant for the assessment, and you can choose a score, 1 of 4 different scores. Here again, it's possible to include other standards, even if you chose a stage of evolution that does not include a particular standard, but you want to include it because you're already doing it, you can also add on to it. So this is just to ensure that the assessment can be as tailored to the CTF as possible. We wanted to make it very, very easily to be tailored so that it can help, hopefully it can help to guide the assessment. To assign scores, you'll find this drop-down button with 4 rating options. We have fully implemented, partially implemented, satisfactory, partially implemented, unsatisfactory, and not implemented. You have to choose one of these scores, and here is where we are encouraging to use the comment section to make any clarifications about why one score was assigned. We do realize that the difference between partially implemented, unsatisfactory, and satisfactory can be somewhat subjective. So this is why it is important that everybody that participates in the assessment agrees on what's the criteria, so that we can ensure the continuity for further assessments. So in the comments, it would be, it is highly encouraged to just give a clarification or explain why a score was given, so that in case the next assessment is performed by different persons, they can still use the previous results. And then once each highlighted standard has a score, then you can move on to the result tab. The third tab, the summary of results, consists of 2 parts. The first part is this overview, with this colored overview that has the 7 core areas with all the numbered of standards that are there. And we included this color key so that it would be really easy to understand. If a standard is not applicable, then it shows up in gray. If it's not implemented, in red. If it's unsatisfactorily implemented, it's in orange. Satisfactory in yellow, and fully implemented in green. So this is a very easy way of visually showing the results of the assessment. And on the second part of this summary of results, then we have a table. The first table is the number of standards per core area, and then importantly, the number of applicable standards for the assessment. So this number of applicable standard changes according to the stage of evolution that you selected. Then we have how many standards are fully implemented, partially implemented or not implemented, the sum of the score by core area, and then also a percentage, so you can see how what's the performance of the CTF. And to have a visual overview, we have also included a spider web with the percentages. So all the core areas are shown. Obviously, the closer the core area is to the center, then that means that there are more opportunity areas or maybe some things to work on. And then also we have included a bar graph for each core area that shows all the standards and the score that was assigned to that standard. So this is all just to make it a bit more visual, to understand where are the opportunities areas, or where can maybe the focus of the improvements be. And then we have reached the last tab, the tab of the practical considerations. And this is something I will say now. It is also explained in the manual, and I will show it now just because I think this is just the most important bit to remember, because we wanted to maximize the accessibility of the tool and we didn't want it to use any macro. This last tab requires one first step before you can get the practical considerations, which is updating the filter. What I mean by this tab contains practical considerations, which are excerpts from the 2020 practice standards. We try to grab the most important, or we consider the most important information from each practice standard and then show it here in a form of bullet points. So what we recommend, and it's only a recommendation, is that on the practical considerations, you filter not implemented or partially implemented unsatisfactorily, which are the two lowest scores a standard can get. Because this is following the logic that those are maybe the ones that CTF would like to work on first. So what you need to do is go to the score drop down and select only 0 and 1 and click OK. And that will just show you, this is just a normal filter, it will just show you which standards have those scores assigned and the practical considerations. So that's the only step. I hope I made myself clear. If not, I'm going to show it now that I will walk you very quickly through the tool. Then this tab also includes a column with external resources that are mainly from the CFA Toolkit website. It's important just to mention that these external resources are just, it's an orientation or a guide towards websites where you might find relevant information, but these are living websites, so we're not sure every time there's going to be relevant information. So just use it as a general guideline, and of course, for more information, please do read the practice standards. This tool by no means intends to substitute the practice standards. It's more they work hand in hand. So if you have any doubt about the practice standards, you should refer to that standard in the document. And now I will share the tool and I will walk you through maybe giving some scores to the first core area so you can see the steps live. But if you have any questions, please feel free to share them in the chat and we can, of course, start answering them.
So while Alejandra is opening the tool, if there are any questions, of course, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. There's a Q&A section. If you don't have questions yet, we can wait until we have the tool on the screen. Of course, we're happy to answer them live. We do have to finish in time because we have the French version of the webinar right after this one. So please don't wait until the last minute to ask your questions. Because then we might need to put them on hold and answer them separately, or we might miss them. Okay, so Alejandra has the tool, so I will leave it up to her.
Perfect, thank you, Amilcar. Yes, so this is just to walk you quite briefly through the tool. Here you can see this is the introduction tab. As the introduction, it has the structure, it explains, it has some explanation about the stages of evolution or the scores that can be assigned, and it walks you also through the 4 tabs. Then once you want to start performing the assessment, you change to the assessment tab. As I will try to make this a bit bigger so we can all see. Yeah, I think this will be okay. The first step, as we mentioned before, is choosing from this drop-down menu. It has the different stages of evolution. In this case, for example, I'm going to use the startup one. And as I mentioned before, the relevant practice standards are highlighted. So you can see here that these are the standards that would need a score assigned to each one of them. Then once I have selected that, then here I will be able to assign the score. So here I'm gonna just assign them arbitrarily just to show you how it should be done. And here, as you can see on the right column, is a column of comments. So that's also where you can feel free to add any useful information that can guide the understanding of the assessment for any person reading it or that has to go through it later. Okay, now that I have assigned a score to each and every one of the governance score area, I can move to the results overview. As you see here, what immediately happens is all of the 10 standards have colors now according to the score that I assigned them. Then we can see here that from the core area governance, the 10 standards were applicable and the different scores to each one of them. And we can also see how the spider web assigns it a score of 40%, and we can visually see the results. So this is what's going to happen. And another important thing you can see here, that for the startup stage of evolution, all of these marked in gray are standards that are just not applicable. And then for the last tab, the tab of practical considerations, as you can see here, I need to go to the score, then just not select all, select 0 and 1, not implemented and partially implemented. And here I get the results. I'm gonna zoom in again so we can read what they say. But here then we would have the practical considerations and the external resources that are relevant for the standards with the lowest scores. It's important to mention this is just a recommendation. You can also see maybe if you want to add 0, 1, and 2, then that's perfect. If you want to see them all the practical considerations, it's okay. If this is just, this is something that we recommend you to do, but you can use the tool as you find, as you see fit, and in the way that can help the assessment the most. So I don't know if anyone has a question already, and yeah.
Thanks, Alejandra. Yes, I see a couple of comments and questions. I wanted to refer to those two questions that we have in the chat or comments. So we see from Karen McDonald, CEO of Caribbean Biodiversity Fund, that this is the next stage, the version CBF used with our network. And yes, we also want to acknowledge the very important contributions made by CBF, because they were very, they were some of the pioneers in the use of this type of tool, and they developed many of the materials that we used as a basis, actually. So this is really a next stage that builds on the work that Caribbean Biodiversity Fund has done. So both the examples included in the practice standards, in the 2020 practice standards, and this tool as well. Also, the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund worked and well, they tested the tool. They were one of the CTFs that tested the tool as well. So we are very thankful for that. Yes, and then they reinforce this idea that there is the regular administration of the tool by a good cross-section of the fund team, board, and staff was key. So this relates to something we mentioned as well, and that's important to reiterate. Then from Shen, from Mozambique, we have a question on how much time do you estimate to fill in the whole tool? Have you tested this yet? And maybe Alejandra will have something else to say, I'm not sure, but yes, we tested the tool with different conservation trust funds. They tested them individually, but we also did it during calls. And I have to say, filling out that tool is very quick. So we could do it with some conservation trust funds during the call itself. The problem is that you need to, of course, gather the evidence. So it depends on the depth that you want to give to the assessment, because you could perhaps within one CTF, if you, and well, of course, your purpose. If your purpose is just to identify some gaps, perhaps, and have a general screening, let's say that you could organize an internal meeting, a one-day meeting or something like that with people from the different areas of work within your team, perhaps a facilitator, and then you can go through the tool. But if you want to do a proper analysis based on evidence and keep track of all the evidence used, this will obviously take more time. And then that's very variable depending on how easily available the documents of the Conservation Trust Fund are, etc. I see that there are more questions from
just to add real quick, I agree with everything that Melker just said, and also just here in the assessment tab, perhaps in the column of evidence by, you have some guidance over where you might find the information. This is also from the practice standards, so you can find all the information there, but we decided to put it here to serve as a bit of a guidance and to maybe hopefully also make more efficient the process of gathering the information needed. But yeah, as Amilcar just said, this should not like filling out the tool should not take a lot of time. Yes. And then I see that Sean also made another question. Can the tool then track over time? So the idea is that you have the same, that you perform these, or you have different versions of this same document over time. So as it is right now, as it stands right now, you cannot add on them, but you can create new ones for each year. And the important thing is then that you can compare them. That's why we make such a strong encouragement or recommendation to make it a very clear process, and that in the comments you explain why each comment is made, because then you can have all of these documents, or the documents of the evaluations over time, and that's the way to track it. Yes, and I can see another questions from James Moni Carl.
I can take on, because I was reading the questions. So from James Moni Carl, yes, well, thanks for the encouragement about tool, and we're happy that it's also seen as a useful resource. Yes, so this builds on the scoring that was well in the practice standards in 2020 version. There are, I believe 2 examples of scores that are presented. So we built on that, and we did consultation with the Conservation Trust Fund. So we made a suggestion of we searched for different scoring options. We use those scoring options from the practice standards that were presented as examples, and we discussed them with the working group and the Conservation Trust Funds that work that help testing the tool. So we arrived to this simple, relatively simple scale, which is actually, it has basically 3 levels, right? But there's one level where we see that it would be too simplistic to just say partially implemented, because some conservation trust funds raise the issue that when one standard is partially implemented, in some cases they are really far with that standard, they are very close to have it implemented, but still partial, and in some cases they are just at the very initial level. So we agreed to include this distinction. Of course, that will one conclusion that we arrived to when discussing this issue of scoring was that this will always be somehow subjective. So it is important. That's why we stress the importance of defining the criteria that will determine that something is partially implemented and is on the unsatisfactory side, and something that is partially implemented and is on the satisfactory side of things. So there is some room there for conservation trust funds to adapt this, be more flexible. Then I also see the comment from Kathleen Mikitin, and I think yes, this is very important. So this is not a substitute for independent evaluation. This could be used by external consultants as well. So this tool streamlines the process. It makes it easier, it standardizes it, it offers something for conservation trust funds who want to do the evaluation, self-assessment internally, to do it in a cost-effective way, and more regularly. But they, of course, independent assessments, let's say, or we call it audit-like assessments, will always be valuable and relevant, and sometimes probably requested by donors or necessary to keep transparency. Also, for as I see in the last part of the comment by Kathleen, to test whether a self-assessment has captured all important issues. So it's always good to review it with some external parties. I haven't read the other questions. I don't know if there is anything else to comment on. I see that there is a conversation on the same. Karen is saying that I think we can do this one more regularly, and the external evaluation maybe every 5-7 years. Then yes, agree. So this can help conservation trust funds, as I was saying, do the evaluations very frequently, perhaps with less depth and internally. But then an external evaluation will always be relevant. I see more comments. I don't know if there are more questions.
I'm sorry, Amilcar. Yeah,
Yes,
we have actually another question that is from Ismail Shimbula. He put it on the Q&A, and it's what is the proposed time frame to undertake the assessment? Is it yearly or quarterly?
Yes, so, well, this is not something that, well, it's not part of the tool itself, of course. It depends on what the purpose is of the assessment, right? But I don't see many reasons to necessarily do it quarterly. In general, if you have an annual plan, let's say, maybe you want to incorporate some adjustments there. So maybe yearly is probably the most frequent time frame I would think about. We know that some conservation trust funds think about doing it every 2 years as well. That also seems reasonable. I don't know if in the chat perhaps some of the conservation trust funds will have other suggestions, but I wouldn't advise doing this too often either, because it will be time consuming to have the evidence gathered and gather the team and do it all across the board. Plus, it might not be too sensitive to changes if you do it more frequently than a year. Yes, I see that we have only 3 more minutes. And I see mainly comments, so I think that I'm not sure if I missed anything. If I did, please, if anyone spotted any other question that might be pending, please record it and we can answer it separately by email or through the networks. But I think it's probably time for us to wrap up. So I will give the floor to the organizers. So for Costa Rica or RedLAC.
Yes, thank you so much, Amilcar and Alejandra. It's been quite an interesting session. Yesterday, we had one in Spanish. In a few minutes, we're going to begin the third one in French. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us, to Amilcar, to David, to Forever Costa Rica, to me, in case you have further questions and comments. The toolkit and the manual will be soon available in the websites of all these institutions. And we hope that you start taking these steps and begin with the self-assessment of the practice standards. We wish you a happy day and thank you so much for your participation.